We are about to go live. One moment. Okay. Hello, Melanie Phillips. How are you today?
Good morning, Avi, from an extremely turbulent London.
I see the headlines on some of the issues, and this is really something. You are in the eye of the storm right now. So please share with us your perspective from where you are sitting right now. Let's get started. The hysteria of Brexit. Where do we stand there, Melanie?
Well, quite honestly, by the time we finish this broadcast, we might be standing somewhere differently from where I'm saying that we are now. I mean, things are moving so fast, and the thing has become so terribly complicated. Virtually nobody can work out precisely what's going on. Basically, what's happened is that Mrs. May produced a kind of coup d'etat, I would say, at Chequers at the all-day meeting with her cabinet, which I think we touched upon when we last spoke, in which she forced through Britain's negotiating position with the European Union to leave the European Union. And that negotiating position has been denounced from all sides, both from by Brexiteers and by Remainers. The Remainers think she didn't go far enough. The Brexiteers think it is a complete sellout and betrayal because it's an attempt to kind of leave the European Union while remaining aligned with it. And the problem with that, from the Brexiteers' point of view, is that if you align with the European Union, you remain to some degree or other under the control of the European Union, its laws, and even more importantly, its court, the European Court of Justice, which means that Britain is not free as a sovereign country to have independent control over its own laws and policies, and equally, crucially, is not free, will not be free to make the trade deals in its own interest because it will be hampered by its connection, its ties, which remain to the European Union. Indeed, President Trump said precisely this, that, you know, he wanted to have a deal with Britain, a trade deal, once Brexit had happened, but he wasn't going to have a trade deal with Britain if it was actually part of the European Union still, because he wasn't going to have a trade deal with the European Union because that's not in his interests. So that's the problem. And what happened politically was that the reaction in the Conservative Party has been absolutely seismic, because the majority of the Conservative Party, unlike the cabinet, which is majority Remainer, and Mrs. May herself is a Remainer, the majority of the party are Brexiteers. And even those in the country who voted Remain in the referendum, many of those, or some of those at least, have said that they are so horrified by the way the European Union has behaved ever since, and so horrified by the weak negotiating position of Mrs. May, and so horrified by what they see as the attempt to reverse Brexit by stealth, that they actually now want Britain to get on with it and to get out of the European Union. So you have a situation in which the Conservative Party is in a state of mutiny and revolt. And as a result, there is a growing, dangerously for Mrs. May, there is a growing number of members of parliament who want her out. And that has reached danger level. There is a level at which, if enough members of parliament call for her to be out, she must have a vote of confidence, or she must be got rid of. I can't recall immediately the precise procedures, but the sword of Damocles hanging over all of them is Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn has been and still is, to a large extent, Mrs. May's human shield. Even those who think that Mrs. May is a disaster and must go do not want to trigger a general election because that carries the risk of Jeremy Corbyn coming to power. And so they are kind of holding fire a bit. I think what they think is that once Parliament resumes after the summer break, which I think would be in October, then if Mrs. May is still set upon a negotiating position, which in the view of the Brexiteers would mean that Britain does not actually leave the European Union, then they will get rid of her, regardless of the risk of a general election. But they don't want to do it now because they think that if they were to provoke her into a vote of confidence like this week, she'd win it. So they want to hold their fire a bit. There is a week to go, roughly speaking, before Parliament breaks up for the summer recess. The party whips are so frightened that Mrs. May can be brought down in that time. They want to head off any further revolt. So they have wanted Parliament's recess to be brought forward. They wanted Parliament to go home this week to shut everybody up. Parliament's decided that's not right. They will stagger on for another week. Who knows what's going to happen in that week? Last night, Mrs. May saw off what could have been a very severe revolt by the Remainer faction in her party and in Parliament, which sought to bring about a situation in which if terms weren't agreed in a certain way by a certain time, then Britain would join the customs union. Now, if Britain joins the European Union's customs union, it effectively doesn't leave the European Union. That was seen off by heaven knows what arm twisting and a few Labour members revolting against their own party whip to join the government. The government squeaked through with just a handful of votes. So Mrs. May, as of this morning, has lived to fight another day. Well, whether she will be in that position by this evening, I cannot guarantee.
Can you just give us some insight why the feeling is that if they'd have a vote challenging Mrs. May this week, she'd win, but waiting till you said when they should wait, they have a possibility of winning, of them winning against her? What's the differentiation there?
Because nobody wants a general election now. They think that it would be they're too frightened of Jeremy Corbyn winning. And also, they think that they will have a greater case to make against her when it can be shown that she has not taken on board the criticism. You see, she's already given ground. She's already accepted various requirements by the Brexiteers. And consequently, the Remainers are beside themselves because they think that, she has been browbeaten into resiling from this negotiating position she forced through at Chequers. And to a certain extent she has, but the thing is still very cloudy. And it's only when we get to the position on the timetable, as it were, the negotiation timetable for Brexit, when we get to the sort of the critical point where it becomes clear that, she's holding fast to this unsatisfactory deal from the point of view of the Brexiteers. If at that point she's holding fast, then she goes. That's the thinking. That's the thinking at the moment. whether that will remain the thinking by the end of the week, I can't tell you. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate the perils for Britain's political whole future at this point. Not just because I'm a passionate Brexiteer and I am very concerned indeed that the Brexit vote will be reversed and that Britain's voters and democracy will be betrayed, but because Britain's in chaos. Its politics is mired now in a kind of terrible stalemate, and there is no leadership. The real problem with Mrs. May is that she's not a leader. By any standard, by any definition, leaving the European Union is fraught with difficulty. It is an enormous undertaking. You can't just leave the European Union to which you've been a member for all these decades, and you are enmeshed in its laws and its policies and its arrangements. You can't leave it without serious grief, and there will be undoubtedly downsides to this. And a real leader would have levelled with the people. A real leader would have said, look, we're going, and it's right that we're going, and there are enormous benefits from our going, but we have to do this properly, and we can't be half in, half out. We voted to go, we're going, and I have to tell you that there may be downsides. It may be rough, But we will weather it because we're British, and that's what we do. We weather the storm. And because we're British, we have in our minds the fact that there is nothing more important than our national independence, and nothing more important than political liberty and democracy. And that's what we've now voted to restore. And that's what we must have in our minds. We will do everything in our power to ensure that the disruption is kept to a minimum, blah, blah, blah. In other words, you level with the people, you take them with you on the adventure. That's leadership. We haven't had that from her at all. She has not sought to take the people with her at all. And that is such a dereliction of duty. On that alone, on that basis alone, she is unfit to be Prime Minister.
Wow. All right. Well, here we're going to go from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party and the whatever you want to call leadership or non-leadership on that side of the aisle. We just have the Labour Party coming up with their own new definition of anti-Semitism, in a sense of rejecting the international accepted definition, coming up with their own. What is going on? And I understand, like, the whole Jewish community of 68 rabbis of all different denominations have come together against this latest fiasco taking place in the Labour Party. Can you please shed some light for us on what this is all about?
Well, you can see the significance of this situation by the fact that, as you've just said, 68 rabbis of different denominations, from Reform through Liberal, through Masorti to Orthodox, have signed a letter saying how terribly concerned they are by the Labour Party's new definition of anti-Semitism. And the chief rabbi himself, who I think didn't sign that particular letter, has come out and said it's that the Labour Party's definition of anti-Semitism is a sign of contempt, an act of contempt towards the Jews of Britain. And, you know, I mean, just pause for a moment. 68 rabbis of different denominations, you know, the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, sitting down, as it were, on the same piece of paper with Reform rabbis. One might think that the Mashiach himself, the Messiah himself, is about to arrive. I mean, This is like unprecedented. And what's brought this about? It is the Labour Party's redefinition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been defined by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in a definition which has gained a great deal of acceptance around the world. And it's been accepted by the British government, and it's been accepted by a host of British institutions as a workable definition. Now, this definition itself, in my view, is not entirely satisfactory, but nevertheless, it's the best that we have. And it makes a stab at bridging the gap, or the division, which is so contentious, between anti-Semitism, old-style anti-Semitism, which is against Jews as people, and the new anti-Semitism, which is against the State of Israel. And what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition does, it bridges that gap by a number of examples. So it says that if you speak about Israel in the following way, then that fits with our definition of anti-Semitism. Now, that's the sticking point for the Labour Party. And what the Labour Party's National Executive Committee, its governing body, did yesterday was to pass, or to adopt, a code of practice, which enshrines a code of anti-Semitism, which redefines, it cherry picks the IHRA's definition in a most tendentious way. What it does is it adopts those bits of that definition which relate to Jews as people or institutions, but it rejects those bits of the definition which relate to the State of Israel. So what it says is that you can attack the State of Israel. What it says in effect is you can attack the State of Israel. Let me get this wording right. It says you need civility of discourse. Well, that's very good, obviously. But it says, in general terms, the expression of even contentious views in this area meaning regarding the State of Israel, the expression of even contentious views in this area will not be treated as anti-Semitism unless accompanied by specific anti-Semitic content, such as the use of anti-Semitic tropes, or by other evidence of anti-Semitic intent. Now, you can't prove anti-Semitic intent. And what that means is that unless you use specific anti-Semitic tropes, and throughout It defines anti-Semitism solely in terms of offensive expressions or activities against Jews as people or Jews as institutions. So unless you accompany your description of Israel by that, it's not anti-Semitic. And consequently, it follows that if, for example, you say Israel is a fascist or a Nazi state, or Israel is guilty of apartheid, or use any of the other phrases which are used to demonize, delegitimize, and prepare the ground for the extermination of Israel as a Jewish state, that's not anti-Semitic. And it is anti-Semitic. I mean, I've always drawn a distinction between the people and the thing. It's not true that everybody using this kind of offensive language about Israel is anti-Semitic. But it is true, I believe, that the discourse itself is anti-Semitic because it singles out Israel alone among the nations of the world for treatment afforded to no other nation based entirely on falsehoods, distortion, omission of information, demonization, delegitimization, obsessive malice, and all the rest, which are the unique signature motifs of anti-Semitism through the ages, which is why this form of discourse is called, rightly in my view, the new anti-Semitism. This is what the Labour Party has now said is not to be considered anti-Semitism. As a result, the Labour Party has given itself a free pass to continue to use the new anti-Semitism, as a result of which many Labour members are beside themselves. I was in Westminster last night at a meeting at the House of Commons, and on the tube coming home, I ran into somebody who is a staunch supporter of the State of Israel within the Labour Party. And she was almost in tears. I said, how are things? I didn't know what had happened at that stage. And I said, how are things? And she said, it's been a terrible, terrible, terrible day. The Labour Party has now made itself into the party of anti-Semitism. On the grounds that it is challenging anti-Semitism, it has adopted anti-Semitism. She was beside herself. A venerable member of the Labour Party, Margaret Hodge, who is one of these sort of elder stateswomen of the party, who is herself a Jew, is reported today to have screamed obscenities at Jeremy Corbyn and called him an out-and-out anti-Semite to his face. So raw is this passion now that's been unleashed within the party. So while the Conservative Party is busy tearing itself apart over Brexit, the Labour Party is now tearing itself apart over the fact that it's become the party of anti-Semitism.
Now, can you just help me understand, before this new definition of anti-Semitism by the Labour Party Executive Committee, they were having a lot of trouble dealing with accusations of allowing anti-Semitism within the party. So you would think that the Labour Party would try to deal with that, to bring the Jewish community closer. And here, this step actually pushes the Jewish community and those supporters of Labour or members of Labour even further away. What is the logic of necessity to redefine anti-Semitism for their own party as opposed to the rest of the world?
Well, there are two things to say about this. The first is that it is essential, if you are a Labour Israel basher, it is essential that you allow yourself to continue to do that. And it's essential that you tell yourself it's not anti-Semitism, because as a Labour member, you tell yourself that you are, because you are on the left, you are anti-fascist and anti-racist. And so you cannot ever allow yourself to believe that anything you stand for is anti-Semitic. And at the same time, it is essential to your ideological worldview that you continue to believe that Zionism is a kind of racism and that Israel is fundamentally illegitimate, that it dispossessed the natural inheritors of the land, and that its activities are malign. That's what they believe. And they believe that they have to continue to say that in the interest of being anti-racist. How twisted is this? We can have a long discussion about the pathology of anti-Israelism on the left. But that's how they see it. And so it was essential that in defining anti-Semitism, they had to allow themselves to continue to demonize and delegitimize Israel. Now, how could they do this without telling themselves they were pushing away the Jewish community? Very easily, because here's the really terrible thing. Jeremy Corbyn surrounds himself and is very friendly towards a number of Jews who themselves take this position, who tell him that Israel is a fascist and a racist state, who tell him that Israel is dispossessing the natural inheritors of the land. They tell him that Israel is behaving illegitimately. These are the people who, for example, said Kaddish for the Hamas after members of the Hamas were killed in the worst day of violence on the Gaza border. And we learned within a few hours that the vast majority of those killed by Israel on that day were supporters and members of the Hamas. A number of young Jews held a demonstration outside the Houses of Parliament in which they said Kaddish for those who were killed, even though they were told they were members of the Hamas. They are the kind of people who Jeremy Corbyn associates with, and they enable him and people like him to tell themselves that they can't be anti-Semitic because these are Jews who very much agree with the position that Jeremy Corbyn and his people are taking on this issue. And furthermore, that these are people who as legitimately represent the Jewish community as the chief rabbi and those people who signed the letter. And furthermore, they tell themselves that the kind of people who signed the letter are right-wing Jews. And consequently, they're the wrong sort of Jews. So we don't want them on board anyway. And consequently, you have this terrible situation in which members of the Jewish community, I use those words in inverted commas, because in quote marks, because some of them are members of the Jewish community in that they are members of synagogues, they associate with the Jewish community. Others have the most tangential relationship with their Jewish identity. But nevertheless, they are members of the Jewish community who are taking this view and who are providing cover for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And the even more tragic thing is that if you talk to some of these people who are members of all these groups that are basically, I call them in my own mind, Jews against Jews, some of them genuinely feel and will tell you genuinely that they support Israel, they love Israel, they go to Israel, and yet they hold these views. And furthermore, they will tell you that they support and promote real Jewish values. And of course, what they're supporting and promoting is the absolute negation of real Jewish values, because what they are promoting and supporting is based on falsehood and on hatred. Unreasoning, unconscionable hatred. But they have told themselves that they are standing for the opposite. So this is the situation. The chief rabbi says it's an act of contempt. The Labour Party's new guidelines are an act of contempt against the Jewish community. He's absolutely correct. From where Jeremy Corbyn is standing, he can say, this is not true, because all these Jews who are my friends, they say, I have done the right thing. That's the tragedy.
Wow. All right, let's move away from British politics. Now we're going to go to international relations for Britain. The next hysteria, Trump. Trump in Britain. There was hysteria about his visit in Britain. We just had the Trump-Putin summit. Hysteria about that summit. Please, Melanie, give us some insight. What have we been witnessing about Trump lately?
Oh dear, isn't it? It's so complicated and difficult. Trump came to Europe, as we know. He first of all he addressed NATO, and he addressed the European Union and Britain, and then he addressed Russia in those sort of three sort of categories of issues. And at every stage, he was met with rising hysteria. Now, most of the hysteria, I think, was completely unwarranted. In my view, he told NATO what it needed to hear. It's not true that he is against NATO as an alliance. It is true that he thinks that that NATO's members in Europe are free riders who have been using American money to avoid paying their fair share of the defense of the free world. And in that, I think he's correct. And I think a number of fair-minded people have said he was correct to call them out. And look what happened. They all stepped up to the plate to some degree and agreed to up their contributions. On the European Union, he came to Germany, he came to Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, and he told her a few home truths, that she was in hoc to Russia. She is indeed, her country, Germany, is highly dependent on Russia for its energy sources. He was correct. When he said she was under the thumb of President Putin, he was correct. Everybody shouted foul, screamed foul, because of course the only received view is that the only person in the world who is under the thumb of President Putin is Trump himself. But he was correct to call out Angela Merkel. He was correct to say that Mrs. May had made a complete mess of her negotiations to leave the European Union. He subsequently, because he was on an official visit in Britain, he subsequently made nice with Mrs. May, because, you know, even Mr. Trump uses diplomacy where he absolutely has to. But nevertheless, we could all see that what he had said was true. Well, we couldn't all see, but I could see. And many people like me could see that what he said was true. And then he went to Helsinki and he met with Putin and he gave this now infamous press conference. And then the balloon really went up, because he was reported as saying that he had basically kowtowed to Putin, he had betrayed America, he had allowed Putin to run away with he'd allowed the idea to lie on the table, or he'd agreed that Putin had nothing to do with interfering with the American presidential election of 2016. It was widely reported that he had agreed that that was the case. He had nothing to do with it. Now, if you look at the transcript of that press conference, you get a very different impression. In some ways, it's worse, because what Trump said was completely incoherent. And it's terrible to have a president of the United States who's incoherent, quite apart from anything else. The man speaks loosely. He doesn't look after his language. He uses words wrongly. And that's terrible, because words are so important. But if you read it, I think, as a fair-minded person, clearly what he's doing when asked about, as he was on a number of occasions by the press, asked about the allegation that Russia interfered with that election in one way or another, what he's overwhelmingly anxious to do is to scotch the idea that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Putin's Russia. And all his questions are devoted to that end. And he kind of almost circumvents the actual question, which was, did Putin interfere with that election? And he turns it to say, I wasn't colluding. There's no evidence I was colluding. There's no evidence there was Russian collusion with me. It's all about me and my campaign. And then there's a more specific question, which is devoted, which again is about Putin's interference with the Democratic Party because of the arrest by the FBI of the 12 Russians suspected of, hacking the DNC computers or whatever it is. And then he makes a mistake. Trump makes a mistake, because in his loose speech, what he says is something to the effect of, I want to know where the servers are. Where are the servers? Why haven't they got the servers? What he's talking about is, why hasn't the FBI seized the Democratic National Committee servers, Hillary's servers? I don't know what servers he's talking about. He's talking about Democratic servers. In other words, why has no one actually gone for the evidence? Why has nobody actually produced the servers to find out the truth of this? And then he makes a mistake. He says, Putin is standing here and he tells me he had nothing to do with it. I have no reason to think that he did. And then he goes back to the servers, but I want to see the servers. So what he's saying is, where's the evidence? But he has said, I see no reason to think that he did have anything to do with it. And this is the hostage to fortune, because he shouldn't have said that. And in context, you can see he's throwing words out, and he's standing next to the man, and you can see how he plays these men like Kim Jong-un. He uses charm, uses diplomacy. He doesn't say bad things about them, because behind the scenes, he is trying to extract from them the deal that he wants, right? Now, he used a form of words which was wrong. And so now we've seen him digging himself into a hole which is really worse almost than what he said originally. He has said, I misspoke myself. Instead of saying, what I said was, I see no reason to think that he did interfere. What I actually meant was, I see no reason to think he didn't interfere. Hello? This is risible. This is ridiculous. And if you look at the transcript, it makes no sense. He didn't mean that. He didn't mean, I see no reason to think he didn't. He meant what he said. And he spoke very loosely. It was like off the top of his head, because what he was thinking about was the servers. And so a fair-minded person would surely say, as I think, it's appalling that you have a president of the United States speaking like this, speaking in such an undisciplined fashion, using language in such a loose fashion, using language wrongly, and also psychologically, he's adopting a position with these very significant tyrants of our age, which is almost obsequious. And that's wrong. But you can see why he's doing it, because behind the scenes, he is making a deal. And if you look at that transcript, what Putin says is very interesting, because everyone was frightened that because of the kind of man he is, Trump would give stuff away. So he would say to Putin, look, you can have the Crimea. I don't care, as long as you give me something else. But Putin says in that press conference, we disagreed on the Crimea. He still won't agree with me, and we have to disagree on this. In other words, behind closed doors, Trump said you shouldn't be in the Crimea. He didn't do what people thought he did. And Putin also says to the journalist who's asked him something about him being kind of, the journalist says, who should we trust? You, Putin, or Trump? Or not Trump. Who should we trust? You, Putin, who say you haven't interfered with the election, or the kind of Mueller conspiracy theory? And Putin says you should trust nobody. Why do you think that Trump and I trust each other? We don't. He says that. He says that. Now, you read that, and then you read the hysteria that Trump is in the pocket of Putin. He's a tool of Putin. He is sucking up to Putin. And Putin has said, I don't trust him, and he doesn't trust me, and he won't give me even the Crimea. So a fair-minded person would not reach the conclusion, I would suggest, that we are being fed by the hysterical media. That's not to say that Trump behaved well. He didn't. But the impression that's being created is wrong.
Wow, that is fabulous analysis. I have to say it, because what you're basically saying is, yes, what his words were wrong, and it sounds horrible and it sounds wrong, and you've always been a critic of his words and his loose lips. However, the hysteria about how his relationship is with Putin, or what they talked about, or whatever deals were made, that is wrong as well.
Exactly. You summarize my views admirably.
No, that's very, very important, because that's not getting across at all anywhere else, and that is critical information. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, and I will hopefully, if I have time today, write it on my website, melaniephillips.com.
Wonderful. That's definitely, people need to read and see that that analysis. That's so important. So very important. All right. Finally, the last hysteria we're going to deal with today, Melanie, is Tommy Robinson. You have been radio silent about Tommy Robinson, from what I understand, because of the legal aspects of writing about him. And you finally came out writing an article. And if I may say so, to preface, I know you as the author of Londonistan. I think many people know you as a very, very big, well-known spokesman about the dangers overcoming Britain because of what you talk about in Londonistan. Yet when it comes to Tommy Robinson, you have a very interesting and different perspective based on the legal aspects of the case that you just wrote about, and I'm sure people are interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yes, I wrote about it for the Times yesterday. It's behind a paywall, so unless you have a subscription, you can't read the whole thing that I've written. And I wrote about it because today, this morning, in fact, the Court of Appeal in London is hearing Robinson's appeal against sentence. To recap, before I speak about this, I must say that I chose my words for the Times extremely carefully because reporting restrictions are still in operation and will be for some time. And so there are certain things I can say, but a great deal I can't say. So you must forgive me, everybody out there, because I will not be able to fully flesh out for you the details of the situation, which would answer the questions that you have. But insofar as I wrote about the subject yesterday, I can tell you what I wrote. And to recap, Robinson was given a 13-month jail sentence in May for contempt of court for live streaming a broadcast outside Leeds Crown Court, including footage of participants in a criminal trial, breaching reporting restrictions. People outside the United Kingdom really don't know, and in America, I know that people have great difficulty in accepting the validity of this, but it is true that Britain's criminal justice system uses quite stringent reporting restrictions. As soon as someone's charged, there are certain things you can and can't say. And when a trial is going on, you can say or do nothing that can prejudice a jury or interfere in the conduct of a trial. So you can say or do nothing that a jury might learn about the defendants or about the case in question that's not been revealed in court. And you can do or say nothing that might possibly intimidate or try to bring pressure to bear upon anyone connected with the trial, the defendants, the jurors, the prosecuting or defense counsel, and so on. Those are the rules. And in America in particular, I know that people find this very difficult to understand and accept, because in America, the First Amendment carries everything before it. Freedom of speech is absolute. And the idea that you're restricted during a criminal trial in saying anything about the defendants or anything about the trial is considered an offense against liberty. And consequently, people dismiss this as a sort of a few arcane rules in Britain of no consequence. It's not. It's very, very important. And the point about what happened to Tommy Robinson is that it would have happened to anybody else. And that's what's not accepted. Because what I've said in my Times piece is that he was jailed because not only did he breach these reporting restrictions, but he, in doing so, broke the conditions of the suspended 3-month jail sentence that was imposed upon him last year for a very similar offence at another court where a trial was taking place. And in that case, the judge, when she delivered his 3-month suspended sentence, said to him, if he did this again, he would be sent to prison instantly, because that's what's done in these circumstances, possibly with an increased sentence. And that's what happened in May. When that happened, there was uproar. One article after another, particularly coming out in America, claimed that Britain was now a fascist state ruled by Sharia law. Every aspect of due process of law has been misrepresented as a fascist conspiracy to silence Robinson and even to have him murdered. It's been said constantly that he was jailed because he spoke out against Islamization. That's untrue. He was jailed because he twice committed contempt of court, risking a trial being stopped altogether. It's said that the length of his sentence was disproportionate. Untrue. Given the way his repeated offence is regarded in Britain normally, it was wholly unremarkable. It said that there was a discrepancy between his arrest by the police for breach of the peace, that's what he was told on the spot, and the fact that he was jailed for contempt of court. And it is said that that discrepancy shows that the state made it up in order to silence him. Untrue. It's common for the police to make an arrest on those grounds while the charge turns out to be different. And the crucial point is that Robinson admitted contempt of court and apologized for it. It said he was tried in secret. This is nonsense. The judge's own ruling could not be fully reported and still cannot be fully reported for the very reason that what Robinson said and did also cannot be fully reported because of the strict rules governing what can and cannot be said in criminal proceedings. It said that you have a double standard here. There are Islamists who are allowed liberty in Britain to spout off their poisonous rubbish, and look at Tommy Robinson, he's in jail. But I believe that that is a false connection. I have always criticised Britain for being far too lax, far too accommodating towards Islamist extremists. But that has nothing to do with jailing somebody for a clear and admitted contempt of court. It's also been claimed that Robinson was sent to prison in order he should be killed. In other words, the state wanted him murdered. But mostly, he's been kept in solitary confinement for his own protection. Okay, solitary confinement, not very nice. But the state is going to some lengths to stop him being harmed in prison. All these facts and more have been brushed aside. Robinson has been presented as a martyr to free speech, and his jailing has been turned into an international cause célèbre. We've had huge demonstrations in London. The Dutch anti-Islam politician Geert Wilders has said Robinson deserves a medal. People in the world, particularly in the United States and elsewhere, simply refuse to accept that Britain has these rules governing a fair trial. They dismiss this as irrelevant. And I think that this is a really disturbing situation because, as I say in the piece in the Times, I have consistently condemned the West's whitewashing of Islamic extremism. I wrote, as Abby, you have said, Londonistan. And ever since, I haven't stopped criticizing the West's accommodation of Islamism and its slide into Islamization. At the same time, I've always condemned those people who refuse to acknowledge that there are millions of Muslims who themselves will not and refuse to sign up to Islamist extremism and who are themselves the most numerous victims of jihadi extremism. And as a result, I have the bizarre experience of being attacked simultaneously at the same time as an Islamophobe and as being an Islamic stooge. And I think that this is a very dangerous situation. We have the incitement of people going on the grounds that Britain is now a fascist state under Sharia law. As I've said, I think that Britain's appeasement of radical Islam is appalling and very dangerous. But at the same time, it is not a fascist state. It is not under Sharia law. And the jailing of Tommy Robinson far from showing it's a fascist state which has upended justice, actually shows that it is upholding the rule of English law. Now, I don't know what the appeal court is going to say today, obviously. We'll know later today. The point is that the appeal is not against the conviction. He's admitted the offence. He's admitted contempt of court. He has apologised for it. His appeal is against the length of the sentence, 13 months. And who knows whether the judges will decide that it is or is not the right sentence. But whatever they decide, I'm absolutely certain that they will make their decision on the grounds of law, on the grounds of the rule of law, on the grounds of precedent in English law. They will not be doing the bidding of the state, let alone the fascist state, because in Britain, we do not have courts that are doing the bidding of the state, and we do not have a state that is fascist. And I think that people who go around saying this, that Britain is a fascist state and that Britain is under the thumb of Sharia law, are not just maintaining perpetrating a falsehood, a demonstrable falsehood about Britain, but they are denigrating the seriousness of what real fascism is, and they are denigrating the true plight of people who really do live under Sharia law. So I would just ask people to be a little more circumspect, not to believe everything that you're reading on social media, including from people who hitherto I have held in some respect as worthy and knowledgeable authorities on the issue of Islam and Islamization. I'm afraid to say they have succumbed to this hysterical, unthinking, ignorant demonization of Britain. And I will never, never hold them in respect again. I have learned a lesson that even people who appear to be soundly based are themselves liable to be swept along by a kind of ignorance and hysteria. And that is a salutary lesson as well. So I would just urge everybody just to take a step back and to look at the evidence and to understand that for the reasons I've set out, unfortunately, and it is very unfortunate, the full facts of this matter cannot currently be disclosed.
All right, and if I could just want one follow-up question, putting this specific case of Tommy Robinson aside, you said what you're able to say. We're not going anymore into that specific case. In terms of Britain and this situation with the continued growth of Islamization in Britain, do you see Britain coming out of that, or is this just a continued trajectory that we're seeing going on right now?
In general, I think that nothing has really changed. Again, I don't wish to come back to the Brexit situation, but you have to understand that Britain is in a state of political paralysis and has been, in fact, for the 2 years since the referendum. Nothing else is even penetrating the official consciousness but that issue. Everything else is kind of parked. And the false assumptions which underpin the British official reaction to Islamic extremism, I'm afraid to say, continue. I'm particularly concerned about the way in which the problem of Islamic extremism is being defined, particularly in the field of education, as a problem of separatism. The idea being that if you don't teach children to conform to the basic tenets of British liberal belief, then that is the reason why you have extremism and extremist violence. And in my view, that is a fundamental error, because separatism is not the issue. The issue is where people are taught to hate and to want to destroy and overcome others who are not of the faith. And that is a problem with Islamic extremism. It's a problem of religious fanaticism, particular to one religion. And because it's being defined as by the British state wrongly as separatism, what one's finding is that there is collateral damage now being done to Orthodox Jews. In their schools, Orthodox Jews are being told by educational inspectors that they have to teach sexualized teaching. They have to teach children that there is such a thing as gay rights, there's such a thing as homosexuality, there's such a thing as gay marriage. And in the ultra-Orthodox schools, they don't teach sexuality at all. They believe in a concept of child sexual innocence. And you may disagree with that. You may think that's wrong, but that's not the issue. It's surely their right to teach children in the way that they want. And what the state is saying, no, it's not their right, that they have to teach sexualization. They have to teach there is such a thing as gay rights. Otherwise, they cannot take their place in British society as tolerant individuals. And really, it's such a fundamental intolerance, liberal intolerance, because what the ultra-Orthodox want to do is just to be left alone. They pose no threat to anybody. They don't mix with non-Jews. One can say that's a terrible thing, but this is the fact. They don't mix with non-Jews. And insofar as they do come into contact with non-Jews, the very last thing they would even think about is what sexuality or what gender is this person, let alone have hateful views towards that person on the grounds of their presumed sexuality. The whole thought process is just not realistic in that community. And that's something that the British state simply cannot take on board, because it's set itself it's put itself into this, it's adopted this false analysis that the problem is separatism, whereas the problem is not separatism. The problem is religiously based and religiously directed hatred.
Wow, that's so sad. And again, I always use the analogy: if a doctor gives the wrong diagnosis, then they're not going to solve the problem. And that's basically what you're talking about right now. Britain continuously misdiagnoses the problem of the extremism within the Islamic community, and not only are they not solving it, they're causing other problems along the way.
Correct.
Great.
Unfortunately, it's very sad. It's more than sad. It's very dangerous.
Right. Wow. All right. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for your clear-headed analysis on all of this hysteria that we're talking about. Again, for those of you who came in later on, we spoke about the hysteria of Brexit. We spoke about the hysteria of the Labour Party's redefinition of anti-Semitism. We spoke about the hysteria of Trump, and then we dealt with the whole issue of Tommy Robinson. Melanie, thank you so much. Anyone interested in continuing to constantly hear Melanie's insight on everything, please go to melaniephillips.com, sign up for her newsletter. Melanie, thank you so much, and continue being this level-headed person. Whether everyone agrees or disagrees with you, you are a very important voice, so thank you for that voice.
Thanks, Abby, for the opportunity as ever, and thanks to everybody for watching and listening.